Let us travel back in time, back more than 2,000 years, to when the world was still a mystery, and distant lands seemed as unreachable as the stars themselves. The story of the Silk Road begins not with a road at all, but with a dream. In the year 138 BCE, during China's Han Dynasty, an emperor named Wu sat upon his throne with a problem that troubled his sleep. The Zhongnu, a fierce confederation of nomadic tribes, threatened his empire's northwestern borders. Emperor Wu needed allies, and he had heard whispers of a people far to the west, the Yuezhi, who had their own reasons to oppose the Zhongnu. And so, the emperor made a decision that would change the world. He sent forth a diplomat named Zhang Qian on what seemed like an impossible mission to travel into the unknown western territories and forge an alliance. Zhang Qian set out with 100 men, crossing mountains and deserts that had swallowed countless travelers before them. This journey was meant to take just a few years. Instead, it would take them. Zhang Qian and his companions were captured by the very people they sought to avoid. De Xiong. For 10 years, he lived among them, even starting a family, all while never forgetting his mission. When he finally escaped and continued westward, he discovered something far more valuable than a military alliance. He discovered a world of kingdoms and peoples unknown to China. Fergana, with its legendary heavenly horses, Bactria, with its sophisticated cities, and Parthia, a mighty empire that stretched toward the Mediterranean Sea. When Zhang Qian finally returned to China in 125 BCE, his reports amazed the imperial court. Though he had failed in his original diplomatic mission, he brought back knowledge of lands rich with goods China had never seen. Glass, wool, grapes, and pomegranates. More importantly, he revealed that these distant peoples desired something China had in abundance. Silk, the luminous fabric that had been a closely guarded Chinese secret for nearly 3,000 years. The Chinese had been producing silk since around 3000 BCE, cultivating silkworms and weaving their delicate threads into fabric so fine, so lustrous, that it seemed to capture moonlight itself. The method of creating silk was China's most protected secret, punishable by death if revealed. Yet the world beyond China's borders had heard rumors of this miraculous cloth, and they wanted it desperately. Zhang Qian's journey revealed something profound, that a continuous route could connect the markets of China to those of Central Asia, Persia, and eventually Rome itself. Within decades of his return, the first merchant caravans began making the long journey, carrying silk westward and bringing back goods and ideas that would transform Chinese civilization. The route these merchants followed would eventually stretch over 4,000 miles, crossing some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. This network of trade routes would come to be known by a name that captures its essence perfectly: the Silk Road. Though this romantic title wouldn't actually be coined until 1877, when German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen used the term Sittenstrage. The ancient merchants who traveled these paths understood its significance. They were creating connections between civilizations that had never known each other existed. The path itself was never a single road, but rather a vast web of routes branching like the roots of an ancient tree. Caravans would wind through the Taklamakan Desert, whose name translates to go in and you won't come out. They would climb mountain passes in the Pamir and Tian Shan ranges, where the air grew so thin that travelers struggled to breathe. And they would stop at oasis towns that bloomed like miracles in the desert, where merchants would rest, trade, and exchange not just goods, but stories, philosophies, and dreams of the distant lands that lay ahead. And so it began, the greatest exchange in human history, not just of silk and spices, but of ideas, religions, art, and knowledge that would flow like water along these ancient paths, nourishing civilizations for over 1,500 years. As dawn breaks over the ancient world, let us follow the caravans as they wind their way westward, their camels laden with treasures that would captivate emperors and common people alike. Silk was the star of this great exchange, but it traveled in company with many other wonders. The Chinese merchants packed their caravans with bolts of silk in every color imaginable, crimson and azure, gold and jade green, but also porcelain so delicate it seemed translucent when held to the light, and lacquerware with surfaces so smooth and glossy they reflected like dark mirrors. Tea, though it would not dominate the trade for many centuries, also made its way along these routes, along with Chinese innovations in papermaking and bronze craftsmanship. But the Silk Road was never a one-way journey. As goods flowed westward from China, an equally magnificent array of treasures made their way east. From Central Asia came the horses that Chinese emperors prized above almost all else. These were not ordinary horses, but the famed Fergana horses, sometimes called heavenly horses or blood-sweating horses. Emperor Wu desired these magnificent animals so intensely that he launched military campaigns to obtain them. These horses stood taller and stronger than Chinese breeds, and their endurance made them invaluable for both warfare and long-distance travel. The mysterious blood sweat that gave them their name was likely caused by parasites, but to those who saw them, it seemed as though the horses themselves were touched by divine power. From the lands of Persia and beyond came goods that dazzled Chinese courts. Persian rugs woven with intricate patterns that told stories in thread. Glassware that sparkled like captured water, a technology the Chinese had not yet mastered. Precious stones, like lapis lazuli, whose deep blue color was more intense than any dye. And spices that transformed the taste of food. Cinnamon, cardamom, and above all, pepper, which became worth its weight in gold. The Western lands also brought grapes, and the knowledge of winemaking, which would transform Chinese agriculture and cuisine. Walnuts, sesame, and pomegranates arrived from the West, adding new flavors to Chinese tables. Even musical instruments traveled these routes. The pipa, a stringed instrument that would become central to Chinese music, originated in Central Asia. The journey these goods undertook was extraordinary in its difficulty. A merchant rarely traveled the entire length of the Silk Road themselves. Instead, goods would pass through many hands, moving from oasis to oasis, from caravan to caravan, each middleman adding their profit to the price. By the time Chinese silk reached Rome, it could cost its weight in gold, making it a luxury reserved only for the wealthiest citizens of the Roman Empire. The caravans themselves were marvels of organization. A typical caravan might include anywhere from 50 to several hundred camels, particularly the two-humped Bactrian camels that were perfectly adapted to the harsh continental climate. These remarkable animals could survive 4 days without water, carry loads of up to 400 pounds, and detect approaching sandstorms before humans could see any sign of danger. They were, quite simply, the ships of the desert, and without them, the Silk Road would have been impossible. The camels walked in long trains, tied nose to tail, their bells jingling in rhythms that carried across the silent deserts, a sound that meant commerce, connection, and hope in the vast emptiness. At the head of each caravan rode guides who knew the desert as intimately as sailors knew the sea. Where to find water, where sandstorms were likely to strike, and which routes avoided the territories of bandits who haunted the more isolated stretches of the road. These merchant caravans would travel roughly 15 to 20 miles per day, a pace that seems impossibly slow to our modern minds, but was sustainable for both animals and humans across the months-long journey. The entire trip from China to the Mediterranean could take well over a year, and many merchants would only travel a portion of the route, trading their goods at major oasis cities before returning home. And so the treasures moved, slowly, steadily, passing from hand to hand, culture to culture, each exchange a small miracle of human cooperation and curiosity. The silk of China warming Roman shoulders, the glass of Rome decorating Chinese palaces. And in this exchange of goods, something even more precious was being traded. The knowledge that beyond the horizon, other peoples lived, loved, and created wonders of their own. Imagine now the moment when, after weeks of traveling through endless desert, a caravan finally glimpses the green of an oasis city on the horizon, like a jewel emerging from the sand. These cities were the beating hearts of the Silk Road, where cultures collided and mingled in the most beautiful ways. Among all the cities along the Silk Road, few could match the splendor of Sun. This ancient city, located in what is now Uzbekistan, sat at the crossroads of routes leading to China, India, Persia, and eventually Europe. Samarkand had been inhabited for over 2,500 years, even before the Silk Road flourished, and its position made it perhaps the most important trading hub along the entire route. Here, merchants from a dozen different lands would gather in bustling bazaars, their voices creating a symphony of languages. Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Sogdian, and many others. The city's wealth allowed it to create monuments of breathtaking beauty, gardens that seemed impossible in the desert climate, astronomical observatories where scholars mapped the heavens, and architecture that would influence building styles across Central Asia for centuries to come. Further west lay Bukhara, another pearl of Central Asia, whose scholars and libraries became legendary throughout the medieval world. For over 2,000 years, Bukhara served as a center of Islamic learning. But long before Islam arrived, it was already a thriving commercial center. Its covered markets, called Tim, protected merchants and their goods from the harsh sun, creating cool, shadowy spaces where business was conducted over cups of tea that could last for hours. To the east, at the edge of the fearsome Taklamakan Desert, sat Kashgar, one of the westernmost cities of what is now China. Kashgar's famous Sunday market, which continues to this day, once drew merchants from throughout the region. Here, the cultures of China and Central Asia met and merged. You could find Chinese silk merchants negotiating with Persian carpet traders. Here, Buddhist monks discussing philosophy with Muslim scholars. Taste cuisines that blended ingredients from 3 different continents. And then there was Dunhuang, the gateway to China proper, sitting at the edge of the Gobi Desert where the northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan merged. Dunhuang became famous for its Mogao caves, also called the Caves of the Thousand Buddhas, where Buddhist monks carved nearly 500 cave temples into the cliff face over the course of 1,000 years. These caves housed not only breathtaking religious art, but also a library that contained over 50,000 documents, Buddhist sutras, contracts, letters, administrative records, creating a time capsule that would reveal the daily life of Silk Road civilization when it was rediscovered in the early 20th century. Each of these oasis cities developed its own system of welcome and protection for traveling merchants. The caravanserai, a type of roadside inn, became a crucial institution along the Silk Road. These structures provided secure courtyards where camels could be housed, rooms where merchants could sleep, and often included baths, shops, and even entertainment. A typical caravanserai was built like a fortress, with high walls and a single heavy gate that could be barred at night, protecting merchants and their precious goods from bandits. In many of these oasis cities, entire communities of foreign merchants settled permanently, creating cosmopolitan neighborhoods where you might find Chinese quarters, Persian districts, and areas where merchants from the distant Roman Empire made their homes. These expatriate communities established their own temples, maintained their own customs, and yet gradually adopted aspects of local culture, creating unique hybrid societies that existed nowhere else on Earth. The cities also developed sophisticated banking and credit systems, as carrying large amounts of gold and silver across thousands of miles was dangerous. Merchants could deposit money in one city and receive credit documents that could be redeemed in another city hundreds or even thousands of miles away. An early form of the financial instruments we use today. This system was built entirely on trust and reputation, for a merchant who failed to honor these agreements would find themselves unable to conduct business anywhere along the Silk Road. These cities were more than just stopping points for weary travelers. They were civilizations unto themselves, places where East truly met West, where ideas cross-pollinated like flowers in a garden, where a merchant from Chang'an might share wine with a trader from Damascus and discover that, despite their different languages and customs, they both laughed at the same jokes and worried about the same things, their families, their fortunes, and the long roads that still lay ahead. Along with the silk and spices, gold and glass, something less tangible but perhaps even more transformative, traveled the Silk Road. Faith itself, the beliefs that gave meaning to people's lives, flowing like invisible rivers from land to land, changing and being changed as they journeyed. Buddhism was perhaps the most profound gift that traveled eastward along the Silk Road. Born in India in the 6th century BCE, Buddhism began its journey into Central Asia and China around the 1st century CE. Buddhist monks walked the same routes as merchants, often joining caravans for safety. And as they traveled, they brought not only scriptures, but also new forms of art, architecture, and philosophy. The journey of Buddhism along the Silk Road took several centuries, and the religion transformed as it moved. In Central Asia, it absorbed influences from Greek culture left behind by Alexander the Great's conquests, creating a unique fusion called Greco-Buddhist art, where Buddha was first depicted in human form wearing flowing robes like a Greek philosopher. By the time Buddhism reached China, it had traveled over 4,000 miles and been filtered through dozens of cultures, each adding their own interpretation. One of the most famous journeys related to the spread of Buddhism was undertaken by a Chinese monk named Xuanzang in the 7th century CE. Xuanzang traveled from China to India, a journey of over 10,000 miles, to obtain original Buddhist texts and study at the great Indian monasteries. His journey took 17 years, and when he returned to China in 645 CE, he brought back hundreds of Sanskrit texts and spent the rest of his life translating them into Chinese. His detailed accounts of the lands he visited became invaluable historical records of Central Asia and India in that era. But Buddhism was not the only faith that traveled these ancient routes. Christianity, in its various forms, also made the journey eastward. Nestorian Christianity, named after the theologian Nestor, reached China as early as 635 CE. The Nestorians established churches in many Central Asian cities, and even in the Chinese capital of Chang'an. The famous Nestorian stele, erected in 781 CE, documents the arrival and acceptance of Christianity in China, written in both Chinese and Syriac script, a beautiful symbol of the cultural exchange happening along the Silk Road. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion of fire worship and the eternal struggle between good and evil, also spread along these routes. Zoroastrian merchants established communities throughout Central Asia, and their fire temples could be found in cities from Persia to China. This ancient faith, which influenced the development of both Judaism and Christianity, found new life along the trading routes, carried by Persian merchants who brought not only goods, but their entire way of life. To distant lands. Later in the 7th century CE, Islam began its own journey along the Silk Road. Following the Arab conquests of Central Asia, Islam spread rapidly through the oasis cities, eventually becoming the dominant religion in much of Central Asia. The Silk Road played a crucial role in this spread. Muslim merchants carried their faith alongside their merchandise. Sufi mystics traveled the routes, seeking spiritual knowledge, and gradually, cities like Samarkand and Bukhara transformed into great centers of Islamic civilization, producing scholars, poets, and scientists whose works would influence the entire Islamic world. Manichaeism, a religion founded by the Persian prophet Mahoni in the 3rd century CE, also traveled eastward, reaching as far as China by the 8th century. This faith, which taught a dualistic view of the universe as a battleground between light and darkness, attracted followers throughout Central Asia, though it would eventually decline. For several centuries, it represented another strand in the rich tapestry of beliefs that characterized the Silk Road. The remarkable thing about these religious exchanges was not that one faith conquered all others, but rather that, in many Silk Road cities, multiple religions coexisted peacefully for centuries. In Tenzing Dynasty, Chang'an, a visitor could find Buddhist pagodas, Nestorian churches, Zoroastrian fire temples, and Islamic mosques, often within walking distance of each other. The merchants who brought these faiths understood something profound. That trade required tolerance, and that the marketplace worked best when people of different beliefs could meet as equals. And so the faiths flowed like rivers along these ancient paths, sometimes merging, sometimes diverging, each one bringing comfort and meaning to travelers far from home. Each one transformed by its journey, reminding us that the human search for understanding and connection transcends all borders. That whether we pray to Buddha, God, Ahura Mazda, or Allah, we all look up at the same stars and wonder about our place beneath them. The Silk Road was a path of wonders, yes, but it was also a journey that tested the limits of human endurance, where nation and men alike posed dangers that claimed countless lives. Yet still the caravans pressed on, drawn by dreams of fortune and the irresistible pull of the unknown. The deserts themselves were perhaps the greatest enemy. The Taklamakan and Gobi deserts were vast seas of sand and stone where temperatures could soar to over 140 degrees Fahrenheit in summer and plummet far below freezing in winter. Sandstorms could rise with terrifying speed, turning day into night and disorienting even the most experienced guides. The Chinese called these storms black dragons, and for good reason. They could strip flesh from bone and bury entire caravans beneath mountains of sand. Water was the most precious commodity in these desert crossings. Ancient Chinese records describe the distances between water sources with meticulous care, for a mistake in these calculations meant death. Some stretches required 3 or 4 days of continuous travel without encountering a single drop of water, and caravans had to carry enough, not just for the merchants, but for dozens or hundreds of camels as well. When water sources were found, they were sometimes nothing more than muddy brackish pools, but to a desperate caravan, they meant life itself. The mountain passages posed different, but equally deadly challenges. The Pamir Mountains, called the roof of the world, reached heights of over 15,000 feet. At these altitudes, the air contained so little oxygen that both humans and animals suffered from what the Chinese called mountain sickness, headaches, nausea, and a weakness that made every step an effort. The cold at these heights was merciless. Men would wake to find their companions had frozen to death during the night, still wrapped in their blankets. But nature was not the only danger. Bandits haunted the more isolated sections of the Silk Road, particularly in the no man's lands, between the protection of different empires. These raiders knew the terrain intimately and could appear seemingly from nowhere, striking at caravans and disappearing back into the desert or mountains with their plunder. Some bandit groups became so powerful that merchants had to pay them tribute for safe passage, essentially creating an informal taxation system that operated outside any official government control. Merchants developed various strategies. The story goes, they traveled in large groups for safety, knowing that bandits rarely attacked well-defended caravans. They hired guards and soldiers, often former military men who knew how to fight, and they developed networks of intelligence, sharing information about which routes were safe and which were currently plagued by raiders. Some merchant families became powerful enough to maintain their own private armies. The great empires that bordered the Silk Road understood that secured trade routes meant prosperity and tax revenue. The Han Dynasty in China established a system of military outposts along the western frontier, creating a protected corridor that extended Chinese power deep into Central Asia. These garrison towns not only provided security but also served as customs posts where the government could collect taxes on the valuable goods flowing through. The remains of these ancient fortifications can still be seen today, crumbling mud brick structures slowly being reclaimed by the desert. Disease was another constant companion on the Silk Road. The same routes that carried silk and spices also carried diseases that could devastate populations. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century CE, which killed millions across the Byzantine Empire, likely traveled westward along the Silk Road. Later, the Black Death of the 14th century would follow these same ancient pathways, demonstrating that the connections between civilizations could carry deadly consequences, as well as beneficial exchanges. Despite all these dangers, the merchants persevered. The profits to be made were simply too enormous to ignore. A merchant who successfully completed the journey might multiply their initial investment 10 or 20 times. But beyond profit, there was also something else that drew them, a sense of adventure, perhaps, or the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves, connecting civilizations, bringing light to distant corners of the world, and proving that human courage and determination could overcome even the harshest obstacles nature could devise. And so, they continued, generation after generation. These brave souls, who risked everything to cross the deserts and mountains, who faced bandits and storms, hunger and thirst, cold and heat, all for the promise of profit, yes, but also for something less tangible. The satisfaction of knowing they had journeyed farther than most people ever would, that they had seen wonders and survived dangers, and that the silk or spices or knowledge they carried might change someone's life thousands of miles away. There came a time when the Silk Road reached its zenith, a golden age when peace and prosperity allowed trade to flourish as never before, and that time was the Temps Dynasty of China, spanning from 618 to 907 CE. Nearly 3 centuries of unprecedented cultural exchange. The Temps capital of Shanghai became the largest city in the world during this period, with a population that may have exceeded 1 million people. To put this in perspective, at the same time, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and one of the greatest cities of the West, held perhaps half that number. Chang'an was a cosmopolitan marvel, its streets filled with people from every corner of the known world. Persian merchants and their distinctive robes, Arab traders with caravans of exotic goods, Indian monks carrying sacred texts, Central Asian musicians playing instruments unknown in China just a century before. The city was laid out in a perfect grid, a masterpiece of urban planning that stretched over 30 square miles, making it roughly 5 times the size of the Baghdad of the same era. Its markets operated day and night, divided into eastern and western sections, each containing hundreds of shops and stalls. Foreign merchants established entire quarters where they lived according to their own customs and laws, creating cities within the city. The Temsi emperors understood that trade brought wealth, and wealth brought power. They established a sophisticated system of regulations and protections for foreign merchants. Special offices were created to register foreign traders, provide them with interpreters, and resolve disputes according to their own laws when possible. This enlightened approach to multiculturalism was centuries ahead of its time and helped to make Chang'an the undisputed hub of the Silk Road. During this golden age, the exchange of ideas reached heights it had never known before. Chinese poetry flourished, often incorporating themes and imagery from foreign lands. Poets wrote of Persian wines and Central Asian horses, of Western dancers and foreign music. The famous poet, Li Bai, considered one of China's greatest literary figures, wrote verses that captured the cosmopolitan spirit of his age, celebrating the wine from grapes introduced along the Silk Road and the diverse peoples who walked Chang'an's streets. The arts transformed as well. Temp's Dynasty poetry began incorporating designs influenced by Persian and Central Asian styles. Cave paintings along the Silk Road showed figures wearing clothing from multiple cultures. Chinese robes mixed with Persian patterns. Buddhist imagery rendered in styles that showed Greek influence. Music underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation. New instruments, new scales, and new forms of composition arrived from the West, fundamentally changing Chinese musical traditions. The Temp's government even established the first real international postal system along the Silk Road. Relay stations were placed at regular intervals, where official messengers could change horses and rest. These stations, occurring roughly every 30 miles, allowed messages to travel from the capital to the western frontier in a matter of weeks, rather than months. While primarily for official use, merchants could sometimes pay to use this system, creating one of the earliest examples of commercial postal service. That in 751 CE, during the Battle of Talas, between the Tang Dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate, Chinese prisoners of war included skilled papermakers. These craftsmen were taken to Samarkand, where they revealed the secrets of their trade. From there, papermaking spread throughout the Islamic world and eventually to Europe, revolutionizing the transmission of knowledge. This single transfer of technology would have profound effects on world history. Before paper, writing was expensive and rare. After paper, knowledge became accessible to far more people. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicine also traveled these routes. Indian mathematical concepts, including the number 0 and the decimal system, made their way to China through Buddhist monks and merchants. Persian astronomical knowledge influenced Chinese star charts and calendar making. Medical texts were translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, from Greek into Persian, from Persian into Arabic, creating a vast, interconnected web of healing knowledge. This was the Silk Road at its finest, a time when borders seemed more like bridges than barriers. When the wealth generated by trade funded the arts and sciences. When a person born in one culture could travel to another and find not suspicion but welcome, not isolation but connection. It was a glimpse of what humanity could achieve when curiosity overcame fear, when the desire to understand exceeded the urge to conquer. For 3,000 years, China guarded the secret of silk production as zealously as any military secret. The penalty for revealing how silk was made was death. And yet, as with all secrets, the truth could not be contained forever. And the story of how silk making spread to the rest of the world is one filled with legend, intrigue, and determined esprit. The Romans called the Chinese the seers, the silk people, and they were obsessed with silk. Roman senators passed laws trying to limit silk consumption, concerned that too much Roman gold was flowing eastward in exchange for this mysterious fabric. The historian Pliny the Elder complained that silk allowed our ladies in their baubles to transfer our wealth to foreign peoples. Yet despite their obsession, the Romans had no idea how silk was actually made. Some believed it grew on trees, like leaves. Others thought it was made from the wool of a special sheep. Still others imagined it was combed from a plant that grew only in China. The truth was both simpler and more remarkable. Silk came from the cocoons of the Bombyx mori caterpillar, the domesticated silk moth. These insects fed exclusively on mulberry leaves, and after gorging themselves for several weeks, they would spin cocoons from a single continuous thread that could be over 3,000 feet long. Chinese workers had learned to carefully unravel these cocoons in hot water, combining multiple threads to create the lustrous fabric that captivated the ancient world. Each cocoon yielded only a small amount of usable thread, which is why silk production was so labor-intensive and expensive. It took approximately 2,500 cocoons to produce just 1 pound of silk. The first successful theft of the silk secret is shrouded in legend. The most famous story tells of a Chinese princess who was sent to marry a Central Asian prince around the 4th century CE. Forbidden to take silk production knowledge with her, she supposedly hid silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds in her elaborate headdress, knowing that guards would not dare to search her hair due to cultural taboos. Whether this story is true or not, we know that by the 6th century CE, SER, ICU, LTU, RE. The art of silk production had definitely spread to the oasis kingdoms of Central Asia. The Byzantine Empire was determined to break China's silk monopoly. Byzantine silk production traditionally dates to around 550 CE, and the story of how they acquired the secret is almost fantastical. According to the historian Procopius, two Nestorian monks who had lived in China approached the Byzantine Emperor Justinian with an offer. They had learned the secrets of silk production and could bring silkworm eggs back to Constantinople. Justinian agreed, and the monks made the long journey back to China, where they collected silkworm eggs and concealed them inside hollow bamboo walking sticks. They then traveled back across the entire breadth of Asia, keeping the eggs alive until they reached Constantinople. Whether this dramatic tale is entirely accurate is debatable, but what is certain is that by the mid-6th century, the Byzantines had established their own silk industry. The emperor maintained an imperial monopoly on silk production, with workshops in Constantinople producing silk exclusively for the court and for diplomatic gifts. Byzantine silk became renowned for its quality, featuring intricate patterns, often depicting Christian religious imagery or imperial propaganda. For the first time, the West could produce its own silk, though it would be many centuries before European silk could match Chinese quality. The spread of sericulture transformed economies across Asia. The oasis cities of Central Asia began cultivating their own silk, which they would then trade or combine with Chinese silk. Persia developed a thriving silk industry, particularly in the northern regions near the Caspian Sea. These Persian silks often featured unique designs that blended Persian artistic traditions with techniques learned from Chinese artisans. As silk production spread, the pure Chinese silk that reached Roman markets became even more precious and expensive. Yet paradoxically, the spread of sericulture also increased the overall trade in silk products, as more regions could now participate in silk weaving and finishing. A complex economy emerged where raw Chinese silk might be transported to Central Asia for dyeing, to Persia for weaving into specific patterns, and then to Byzantine territories for final finishing and sale. The Chinese government attempted to maintain some control over this spreading industry by keeping the very best silk moth strains and the most advanced production techniques as state secrets. Chinese silk remained the gold standard, with its unmatched luster and strength. Even today, after centuries of sericulture around the world, connoisseurs can often distinguish Chinese silk by its particular quality. And so, the secret escaped, carried in a princess's hair, hidden in a monk's walking stick, whispered from merchant to merchant across the vast distances of the Silk Road. And with each revelation, with each new silkworm that hatched in a foreign land, the world became a little smaller, a little more connected, proving that knowledge, like water, will always find a way to flow from where it is abundant to where it is needed. Let us journey now to the western terminus of the Silk Road, to Rome itself, where silk arrived as if from another world, and where the Roman elite would pay staggering prices for fabric they believed was more precious than gold itself. The Romans first encountered silk during their expansion into the east, when they fought the Parthian Empire in 53 BCE. At the Battle of Roman legionnaires were reportedly demoralized by the sight of Parthian banners made of shimmering silk that caught the sunlight like water. It was a psychological weapon as much as a beautiful textile. Something so foreign and magnificent that it seemed almost supernatural. As silk began to trickle into Roman markets through Parthian and later Persian intermediaries, it created an immediate sensation among the Roman elite. Silk was valued by weight, often considered equal in price to gold. Some sources suggest that a pound of silk could cost as much as a pound of gold, making even a simple silk garment worth a fortune. Only the wealthiest Romans could afford it: emperors, senators, and the most successful merchants and landowners. The Roman fascination with silk led to some interesting cultural developments. Initially, silk garments were considered somewhat scandalous because of fine, translucent quality of pure silk revealed more of the body than traditional Roman clothing. Conservative Romans denounced silk as decadent and immoral. The philosopher Seneca complained about silk dresses, asking rhetorically, can they be called clothes at all, when they provide nothing that could possibly afford protection for the body or modesty? Yet despite such moralizing, demand for silk only increased. Roman workshops developed techniques to stretch the expensive fabric further by unraveling the tightly woven Chinese silk and read it with linen or wool threads to create a lighter, more voluminous fabric they called silk. This allowed more Romans to afford silk garments, though purists considered this adulterated silk inferior to the genuine Chinese product. The Romans were intensely curious about the source of silk. They had trade relationships with intermediaries, but had never actually met the Chinese directly. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek navigator's guide written in the 1st century CE, mentions the silk-producing region far to the east, but provides only vague information. The Romans called China Syrica, and the Chinese Empire remained largely mysterious to them. There were, however, occasional direct contacts. In 166 CE, Roman envoys, claiming to be sent by Emperor Marcus Aurelius, arrived at the Chinese court, though Chinese records suggest they may have been merchants claiming imperial credentials to gain better trading terms. Regardless, this marked one of the few documented direct contacts between the two great empires. The Chinese chroniclers noted the arrival of these men from Zhang Qian, as they called the Roman Empire, and recorded that they brought gifts of ivory, rhinoceros, or an tortoise. The Silk Road goods that reached Rome included far more than just silk. Roman archaeological sites have yielded Chinese mirrors, lacquerware, and even fragments of silk with patterns that could only have been produced in China. In return, Roman glass, metalwork, and coins have been found in Chinese tombs, showing that this exchange, however limited, was definitely real. Rome's demand for Eastern goods created a significant trade imbalance. The 1st century historian Pliny the Elder estimated that India, China, and Arabia drained the Roman Empire of approximately 100 million sesterces per year. This massive outflow of Roman gold and silver to the east was a constant concern for Roman economists and moralists, who saw it as a symptom of Roman decadence and weakness. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE did not end Western demand for silk, but it did disrupt the trading networks. Byzantine Constantinople became the primary Western consumer of silk, and as we learned earlier, eventually developed its own silk industry. Yet the memory of those early days persisted. When silk first arrived in Rome, so foreign and so beautiful that it seemed to be woven from moonlight itself, a tangible connection to the mysterious East that lay beyond the edge of the known world. And so we see that the Silk Road connected not just China and Central Asia, but reached all the way to the heart of the Western world. Roman senators draped themselves in fabric that had traveled 5,000 miles. Chinese craftsmen worked silk into patterns, never imagining the distant lands where it would be worn. And in between, countless merchants and caravans served as the threads that wove these distant civilizations together. There came a time when the Silk Road would experience its final great flowering, an era when a single power united nearly all the territories through which the ancient trade routes passed. And that power emerged from the steppes of Mongolia with a force that would reshape the world. The Mongol Empire. In 1206 CE, a warrior leader named Zhang Qian was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler, by a gathering of Mongol tribes. What followed was one of the most remarkable military expansions in human history. Within a few decades, the Mongol Empire would stretch from Korea to Eastern Europe, encompassing more territory than any empire before or since. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, and especially under his successors, the Mongols controlled virtually the entire length of the Silk Road. This conquest was devastating for many cities and peoples along the Silk Road. The Mongol armies were ruthless, and cities that resisted were often destroyed completely. Their populations massacred or enslaved. Samarkand, Bukhara, and many other great Silk Road cities were sacked, their libraries burned, and their prosperity shattered. It seemed, at first, like the end of the Silk Road era, but something remarkable happened. Once the Mongols had conquered these vast territories, they proved to be surprisingly effective administrators and protectors of trade. The Mongols understood that merchants brought wealth, and wealth brought power. Under what became known as the Pax Mongolica or Mongol Peace, the Silk Road experienced a level of safety and efficiency it had never known before. The Mongols established a sophisticated relay system called the Yam, which consisted of stations positioned about 25 miles apart across the entire empire. At each station, fresh horses were kept ready, and messengers carrying official tablets of authority could travel at extraordinary speeds. A message could travel from Beijing to the Black Sea in just a few weeks, a journey that previously took months. While primarily for official communications, merchants with proper credentials could also use this system. The Pax Mongolica meant that, for the first time, a merchant could potentially travel from one end of the Silk Road to the other under the protection of a single government. The Mongols issued special passports called peza, tablets made of gold, silver, or wood depending on the bearer's importance. These passports guaranteed safe passage, the right to requisition horses and supplies from the Yam stations, and protection from local authorities. A merchant carrying a peza was under the direct protection of the Mongol Khan himself. This unprecedented safety and efficiency led to a boom in trade. European merchants, particularly Italians, began traveling deeper into Asia than ever before. The Polo family of Venice became famous for their travels, especially Marco Polo, who claimed to have spent 17 years in China in the service of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. Marco Polo's book, The Travels of Marco Polo, written after his return to Italy in 1295, gave Europeans their most detailed look yet at the wonders of China and the lands along the Silk Road. Whether all of Marco Polo's claims were accurate is debated by historians. Some details in his accounts seem questionable, and some scholars have even suggested he may not have reached China at all. But accurate or embellished, his book had an enormous impact on European imagination. It described the vast wealth of Chinese cities, the paper money that seemed like magic to Europeans who still used coins, the coal that burned like wood, and countless other marvels. This book would later inspire explorers like Christopher Columbus, who carried a copy of Marco Polo's travels with him on his voyage. The Mongol period also saw increased cultural exchange. Chinese inventions, like gunpowder, the compass, and printing techniques spread westward at an accelerated pace during this time. European artistic styles began to influence Asian art, and Asian artistic motifs appeared in European illuminated manuscripts and paintings. The exchange of knowledge reached levels approaching those of the Temps dynasty's golden age, but the Pax Mongolica carried within it the seeds of its own decline. The same protected trade routes that allowed goods and ideas to flow freely also allowed diseases to spread with unprecedented efficiency. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death, likely originating in Central Asia, traveled along the Silk Road routes with devastating speed. By some estimates, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, and caused similar devastation in many parts of Asia and the Middle East. The plague struck hardest at the cities and trade centers, precisely the places where Silk Road commerce had been most vibrant, and so the Mongol century brought both the brightest flowering and the beginning of the end for the ancient Silk Road, a time when the routes were safer and more traveled than ever before, when East and West came closer to true understanding than they had in millennia, but also when that very closeness allowed catastrophe to spread, reminding us that connection always carries both promise and peril, that the roads that unite us can also transmit our sorrows.